It was supposed to be just another late-night walk through Manhattan. Frank Sinatra had been restless in his hotel suite at the Carlyle, the silk wallpaper seeming to close in after another sold-out show at the Copa. 3 standing ovations, roses thrown at his feet, women screaming his name. The applause still echoed in his ears, but something felt hollow about it all. Empty. So he walked. The November air cut through his charcoal overcoat as he wandered down Bleecker Street, hands buried deep in his pockets, fingers absently rolling his mother's rosary beads. Neon signs flickered against rain-slicked pavement, casting fractured rainbows on the asphalt. Most of the city slept, but Frank's mind wouldn't quiet. Success had become a prison of expectations, each performance a carefully choreographed dance he'd performed 1,000 times. The streetlight stretched his shadow long and thin across the wet concrete. He passed late-night diners where insomniacs hunched over coffee cups. He walked past jazz clubs where younger singers tried to capture what he'd already perfected and grown tired of. The city's heartbeat pulsed around him, but he felt disconnected from it all. That's when he heard it. A piano. Not the polished, pristine sound of Carnegie Hall, but something weathered and real, raw. The melody drifted from a narrow basement bar called Murphy's, a place he'd never noticed despite walking this street countless times. The music pulled at something deep in his chest, a longing he'd forgotten existed. Frank paused at the top of the chipped stone steps leading down to the bar's entrance. Through the grimy window, he glimpsed a figure hunched over an upright piano, fingers dancing across keys that had seen better decades. The man played Autumn Leaves with a tenderness that made Frank's throat tighten. The red door was unmarked, paint peeling like old scabs. Frank hesitated. This wasn't his world anymore. He belonged in penthouses and private clubs, not basement dives where broken dreams went to die. But the music called to him. The basement was thick with cigarette smoke and whiskey fumes. A handful of late-night drinkers nursed their sorrows in shadowy corners. A woman in a faded cocktail dress staring into her gin. A man scribbling notes on napkins. A couple holding hands across a table scarred with old initials. At the piano sat a man in his 70s, silver hair catching the amber light from a single bulb overhead. His face was lined with stories, his fingers calloused from a lifetime of music that had never made him rich or famous. He wore a threadbare navy jacket over a white shirt, pressed so many times the collar had grown soft as whispers. Frank slipped into a booth near the back, pulling his hat low. The pianist continued playing, unaware of his famous audience. There was something about the way the old man's shoulders moved with the music, the gentle way he coaxed emotion from those worn keys. This wasn't performance. This was prayer. When the song ended, silence filled the space. Frank found himself applauding softly, the sound of his leather gloves creating a muffled rhythm. The old man looked up, surprised. His eyes were the color of aged whiskey, wise and weary. "Didn't think anyone was paying attention," the pianist said, his voice gravelly but warm. "Most folks just want background music for their drinking." "Hard not to pay attention to something that beautiful," Frank replied. "That was extraordinary." The old man smiled, and Frank noticed how it transformed his entire face, erasing years of disappointment. He studied Frank's features in the dim light, recognition flickering, but not quite catching fire. "You play?" the pianist asked. "I sing," Frank said simply. "Ah, a singer." The old man's eyes sparkled. "Professional?" Frank felt the weight of his fame like a stone in his chest. "You could say that. What's your name, son?" Frank hesitated. In this forgotten corner of the world, he didn't want to be Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board. He wanted to be just another music lover sharing a quiet moment. "Francis," he said simply. The pianist extended a weathered hand. "Charlie Hoffman. Been playing these particular keys for 15 years now." They shook hands, and Frank felt the connection that exists between musicians, that unspoken understanding of what it means to bleed for your art. "You write music, Charlie?" Charlie's eyes grew distant. "Used to. Wrote for some of the greats back in the day. Billie Holiday recorded one of my songs in '42. Midnight Confessions. You might know it." Frank's breath caught. He knew the song intimately, had been planning to record his own version next month. It was one of the most hauntingly beautiful songs about lost love ever written. "You wrote Midnight Confessions?" Frank whispered. "Lifetime ago. Charlie shrugged. Industry changed, I changed, or maybe I just got old and forgotten. Frank leaned forward. Music like yours doesn't get forgotten, Charlie. It just waits for the right moment to be remembered, Charlie chuckled, returning to the keys. He began playing something Frank had never heard, a haunting melody that seemed to capture every broken dream in the room. What's that one? Frank asked. Something I'm working on, Charlie said. The Weight of Stars, about how dreams can become heavy when you carry them too long. The lyrics weren't sung, but Frank could feel them in every note. Here was a man who understood the cost of dreams, who had lived through the music industry's harsh realities without losing his soul to its machinery. Play it again, Frank whispered. Charlie's hands found the keys once more, and this time Frank heard the entire story in the music. A young composer with big dreams, war years, love found and lost, success that came like lightning and went like mist. A man who chose to keep making music even when the world stopped listening. Frank felt something crack open in his chest. When had he last felt music this deeply? When had a song last moved him to tears instead of just applause? Charlie, Frank said quietly, that song, it's extraordinary. It's the most honest thing I've heard in years. The old man's hands stilled on the keys. You really think so? I know so. Frank pulled out a business card. His hands trembled slightly as he handed it across the space. I'd like to record it. Give it the audience it deserves. Charlie took the card, squinting in the dim light. When he read the name, his eyes widened. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board himself, sitting in Murphy's basement like any other music lover. Mr. Sinatra, Charlie began. I can't believe... Francis, Frank corrected gently. Tonight, I'm just Francis. A guy who needed to remember why he fell in love with music in the first place. Charlie's eyes filled with tears. I haven't played for anyone who truly listened in more years than I can count. Frank walked to the piano and sat beside Charlie on the bench. Would you teach me the song, not the way my arrangers would want it, the way you meant it to be played? For the next 3 hours, Frank Sinatra sat beside a forgotten composer in a basement bar, learning a song that would never make the charts but would restore his soul. Charlie taught him not just the melody, but the spaces between the notes where the real meaning lived. He showed Frank how to find the heartbreak in the pauses, the hope in the resolution. They played and talked until dawn crept through the grimy windows. Charlie shared stories of the golden age of jazz, of late nights in Harlem clubs where the music was so pure it could make grown men weep. Frank confessed his own struggles with fame, the way success had somehow separated him from the very thing that made him successful. You know what I miss most? Frank said, as Charlie's fingers traced a gentle melody. The silence between the notes, the moment before the song begins when anything is possible. Charlie nodded. That's where the music really lives, not in the applause or the reviews, in the quiet moment before you begin. The thing about music, Charlie said, is that it's not about the audience, it's about the truth, and the truth is the same whether you're playing for one person or 10,000. When morning light finally forced them to acknowledge that night had ended, Frank made Charlie a promise that would risk everything. He would record The Weight of Stars exactly as Charlie played it, with Charlie himself on piano. No orchestra, no arrangement committee, no commercial considerations. The record label executives would be furious. His manager would threaten to quit. Critics would call it career suicide. Radio stations would refuse to play it. Frank didn't care. That night in Murphy's basement, he had rediscovered what fame had nearly stolen from him, the sacred connection between artist and art, the reminder that music's greatest power lies not in its ability to generate applause, but in its capacity to touch souls. The Weight of Stars was released 3 months later. It peaked at number 93 on the charts and was largely ignored by radio. But it became the song Frank was most proud of, the one that reminded him why he sang in the first place. Charlie Hoffman played piano on that recording and many others that followed. He never became famous, but he became something better. He became the keeper of music's true spirit, the man who reminded Frank Sinatra that the best performances happen when only the music matters. Years later, Frank would tell interviewers that meeting Charlie changed his life, but he never revealed where or how. Some mysteries are too sacred to share. Sometimes the most important voices we hear aren't the loudest ones. Sometimes they're playing in basement bars at 3 in the morning, waiting for someone to truly listen. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we stop walking and go down those stairs into the smoke and shadows where the real music lives. The story doesn't end there. 3 months after The Weight of Stars was released, Frank received a letter at his Beverly Hills home. It was written in Charlie's careful handwriting, telling him that the old pianist had been diagnosed with emphysema. "But I'm not afraid anymore," Charlie wrote. "That night with you reminded me that I've lived a full life in music. I may not have sold millions of records, but I touched one person who mattered. That's enough for any songwriter." Frank flew to New York the next day. He found Charlie in a small apartment above Murphy's Bar, surrounded by sheet music and faded photographs. The piano Charlie had played for 15 years had been moved upstairs. "You came," Charlie whispered. "Of course I came," Frank said, sitting beside the old man's bed. "You're family now." They spent Charlie's remaining months working together. Frank would visit whenever he was in New York, sometimes bringing his guitar, sometimes just listening as Charlie played his unfinished compositions. Together, they completed 17 songs, each one capturing the honest beauty Charlie had dedicated his life to creating. When Charlie passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in March, Frank was there holding his hand. The funeral was small, just a few regulars from Murphy's, some old jazz musicians, and Frank Sinatra sitting in the back pew. Frank kept every one of Charlie's compositions, recording them over the next decade on quiet albums that his record label barely promoted. They never sold well, but they became treasures for music lovers who understood that the best songs aren't always the most popular ones. In his final interview, Frank was asked about the songs he was most proud of. Without hesitation, he mentioned The Weight of Stars and the other Charlie Hoffman compositions. "Charlie taught me something I'd forgotten," Frank said. "He taught me that music isn't about being heard by everyone. It's about being truly heard by someone." Today, if you visit the small apartment above what used to be Murphy's Bar, you'll find a simple plaque that reads, "Charlie Hoffman lived here. He wrote songs that mattered." It was placed there by Frank Sinatra himself, a quiet and lasting tribute to true friendship and music that endures forever, always.